So people in the AI field refer to AGI, which is Artificial General Intelligence, a general purpose AI that can emulate or even improve on the cognitive ability of a human in kind of any realm. If the AI has, like scientific research ability, it can start augmenting itself very quickly. It could be like having, like 1,000 kind of Stephen Hawkings or von Neumanns all working on the same project at once, 1,000 times faster than any human. I mean, that could kind of, cure cancer in like the first 30 seconds.
The future is more than just science and speculation. It's a mirror of our choices, revealing what we value, fear, and hope for as a species. It's an idea that Tom O has been mulling for some time. As a journalist, he investigates catastrophic risks and the bold visions that might help us survive them. From super volcanoes and pandemics to limitless clean energy and the possibility of transcending death itself, Tom's new book offers a striking picture of how humanity could end or how it could begin again. So, what futures should we prepare for? And why might our greatest threats also be gateways to extraordinary progress? That's all ahead here on Visionary, in association with Here East. Tom O, welcome to Visionary.
Thank you for having me.
Your book is called Anti-Catastrophe League. Why? Tell me about that title.
Well, it's an authorial conceit, to tell the truth, because the theme of the book is humanity's endeavours to avert its own extinction. And generally that's kind of being done by our fellow humans, or some of them anyway. And so there's this very loose collection of people who I've tried to authorialise into a kind of coherent narrative. And so that's why I've called it that, because these people are a disparate league and they're trying to prevent catastrophe.
So what is a catastrophe?
Well, I'm glad you asked. A catastrophe, in the kind of loose definition that I use in the book, is something that could kill a great many of us or all of us. And so researchers use the phrase catastrophic risk for something that could kill lots of us, and existential risk for something that could kill all of us. And with catastrophe, I try to bundle those things together, and that's what the book is about. And examples could be asteroids hitting the planet, or supervolcanoes erupting and causing a kind of volcanic winter from which we don't recover, or something terrible to do with AI, or a very bad pandemic. All of these things and more could be catastrophes.
So can we just delve into those a little bit more? Because I was reading what you were saying about it, and just you were giving the scale of these. So you were talking about the last time a supervolcano went off, and it was 78,000 years ago or something, and the fact that if it happened again, you likened it to how many times the blast of Hiroshima?
I can't remember the precise number, but it makes the Hiroshima blast look like child's play. Even in kind of recorded history, there have been moments like that of, I think it was the Toba volcano in the early 19th century, where a volcano goes off in Indonesia. It might not even be a supervolcano, and that causes famine in Europe that summer because there's so much soot in the atmosphere. And there's a scale of explosivity in terms of volcanoes, the VEI scale, and it's logarithmic, which means that the next one up is kind of 10 times greater than the previous one. And so this would have been, I don't know, VEI 7 or something, maybe lower, and the scale goes up to 9.
How did experts rank threats generally, not just within volcanoes?
Well, I think it does depend on the experts, and there are very different ways of looking at this stuff. And some experts would focus more on kind of economic disasters. I was looking more at things that really could kill a lot of people at once. And so it depends who you ask for, but lots of the people I spoke to would rank AI and pandemics at the top of that list, just because they could go so badly if they do go badly, perhaps more so than a very bad asteroid would be, because asteroids asteroids come at us pretty infrequently, and we already know how to deflect them, at least kind of in principle. But it might be that a pandemic could hit us next year. So that's one of the reasons that it's generally thought to be a kind of graver threat to us.
And I mean, you also point out how, so for instance, if there is a sudden tsunami, a lab that has all these awful pathogens in it, we could get both the tsunami and this horrible disease.
Yes, so this is not an original point of mine, but there's this concept called cascading risks. And it's as troubling as it sounds, because as you say, we could have a tsunami that hits somewhere like Singapore or one of these dozens of cities where there are labs that handle the top grades of pathogen. And unfortunately, once something goes wrong in a kind of complex, interconnected global system, that can create further problems. So yes, a volcano this is something I wrote about in the book, the Strait of Malacca, which is the kind of narrow strip of sea between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, has lots of active volcanoes around it and lots of human activity as well. So one of the worries the researchers that I spoke to was that something like that might happen. There might be an eruption, an earthquake, a tidal wave, something like that, and then this, it cascades into the lab, and then who knows what happens. There have been loads of examples of lab leaks in the past, so we just better hope that that the labs are waterproof.
Wow, I mean, it is really scary, but in fact, we need to take hope, because what you've written about are the people who are working against all of this. So how do we stop them?
Okay, so this is going to take about 8 hours, but we can...
Let's narrow it down. All right, so you mentioned that asteroids heading towards Earth, we've already done some work on that. And I think because the end of the world was predicted for Friday the 13th, 2029, erroneously it turned out.
Well, there was a 2012 prediction as well. So we've made it through that one too. But as for that particular asteroid, often there'll be kind of some alarm in the global press because some asteroid seems to be heading roughly in our direction, but we're not so precise in our monitoring of them that there isn't massive margin for error. So when you hear about an asteroid in the news, it's probably going to hurtle about 1 million miles past us. So these things happen, but we have actually proven that we can deflect an asteroid. NASA and some other organizations did that in 2022. And I think that's a lovely example of a collaboration that can actually achieve something pretty spectacular, essentially using very good engineering. The problem with kind of other catastrophes that I write about is that they're so kind of socially complex and interconnected. And pandemics are kind of one example where you can't just like fire a projectile at the pandemic and then you don't have to worry about it. It's a bit more difficult than that, but nevertheless there is cause for hope, I think.
So who's doing the sort of frontline work on pandemics?
Okay, well, imagine that I currently have a cold and I'm talking and I'm sort of spraying particles into the air, and if that light there were a far UVC light, it would be zapping the pathogens in the air before they reach you. And normal light doesn't do that. And we get very strong. We have very strong light in laser, but the problem is that if you look into a laser, you will damage your retina. And so far UVC light could be a very effective tool. And people are working on bulbs that could be kind of rolled out in airports and things like that. So that's one kind of technological innovation that might help. There are also people working on diplomatic measures as well. So treaties that would enable the countries of the world to send a sort of scientific group into a country where a pandemic has erupted. And the idea would be to kind of look at the kind of ballistics, as it were, and see where it emerged from. And the idea is that if you have provision for this kind of action, it means that any country who has one of these labs, which are a bit risky, will kind of be forced through these incentives to be a bit safer because they know there'll be an investigation. So I like to think of it in those two buckets, the kind of technical and the diplomatic.
All right, then. What about volcanoes?
Well, as in how do we stop a volcano? Well, that's never been done, so that's a bit trickier. And in fact, even if you bring up this idea with volcanologists or geologists, often you'll be laughed out of town. So it depends who you ask. But there was a paper from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in, I think it would have been about 15 years ago. I can't quite remember. But the idea, I mean, well, let me try and outline the scale of the problem. Like, supervolcanoes are just so large, and because we can't very well model what's going on under the surface, we can't really scan rock very effectively. We don't really know when they're going to go off. We don't quite know where the magma is either. We could potentially pile huge amounts of mass on top of a supervolcano and hope that delays the eruption. That's one idea that's been floated, but that just kicks the can down the road. So this plan from the NASA JPL involved basically spending, and I kid you not, centuries drilling very deep holes around the perimeter of where we think the supervolcano is, and drawing up thermal energy via geothermal power plants. And as I say, doing that for centuries, and by doing so, draw away enough thermal energy that it doesn't eventually manifest in the kinetic energy of the volcanic eruption.
And that thermal energy could then be reused, presumably.
Well, yes, yeah, I'm very excited about geothermal power because there's an awful lot of it. It's 24/7. It wouldn't take scientific breakthroughs beyond scientific imagination to start harnessing it very, very effectively across the world. So this is one kind of happy example of a sort of inverse cascading risk, where we solve one problem and then use that solution to address another one.
I've been trying to avoid AI, but I can't for much longer, just because it does feel so frighteningly real, and that actually more and more we're seeing talk of, I mean, I think you possibly even used the words, when humans and superintelligence merge.
Oh, did I? God, that's a bit of a claim, isn't it? I think I would like to amend that to an if. And there's an awful lot that can happen between now and then,
yeah,
I suppose.
Is that where we're heading?
Again, it depends who you ask, and I think that the skeptics are currently feeling empowered because GPT-5 was not that big a step up from GPT-4, and there's been a lot of investments in AI, and it might be that we're currently in a bubble and it'll collapse. But I think that we can zoom out slightly and see a trend of increasing machine intelligence, and you might disparage the kind of quality of the intelligence that we've made so far, but clearly it's in humanity's interests to keep developing it, and so I think there is a good chance that this trend simply continues and we create intelligence greater than our own, and then the world gets, shall we say, exciting and unpredictable.
And ends.
Certainly there are plenty of people in the communities of researchers I spoke to who are very worried about that kind of thing, and that could be because powerful AI is misused. It could be because a super intelligent AI might, in trying to preserve itself, which pretty much all life does, will seek to remove constraints on its behavior. And of course, ultimately, we will be constraints. We might in some way interfere with its interests. And so that isn't the character of the AIs that we've created so far, which are like terrible, obsequious bootlickers if you've ever used ChatGPT. But this is certainly a fear of some people in the research field.
When you were doing your research, and clearly an enormous amount of research went into this book, was there anything that really surprised you?
Anything that surprised me? Well, I'd by the time I was doing the book, I'd already done some research and some work in these fields, so I had an idea of the lie of the land, I suppose. Anything that surprised me, I mean, I've already mentioned geothermal power, but I'm such a kind of fanboy of like engineering very deep holes that I'm going to bring it up again. And there was one thing that really kind of excited schoolboy delight in me, and the context here is that like one of the kind of several problems to do with accessing high heat under the surface is just that drilling takes ages and is expensive, and you have to use rotary drills. And when you get sufficiently deep, like 10 plus kilometers, historically one of the biggest time sinks was just swapping out the drill bit because it would get like snarled up and blunt. And so it doesn't really make much financial sense to dig or to drill very deep, even if you can be assured that you'll be able to sustainably draw heat out of it. But there is a cool innovation, which is essentially a laser This was pioneered by a guy who had been working on fusion, and he had this thing called a gyrotron, which fires kind of very concentrated electromagnetic radiation at a bit of plasma. And then he thought, why not just fire it at some rocks? And he brought some rocks in and found that it kind of made indentations in the rocks. And so you're probably putting two and two together, which is that they are now firing lasers at bedrock in the hope that they can get kind of 20 kilometers deep and then access water that is kind of so hot and so compressed that it has the energy density of natural gas.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there are many problems that they'll still have, right? Things are so hot down there that you can't really keep the hole still, and you can't put downhole electronics there because they'll melt. All those problems emerge. But certainly that was something that surprised and excited and delighted me.
So you've talked about the sort of scientists and medics and people on the front line who are doing their best to avoid these catastrophes. But what can ordinary people do? How can we be prepared for this future that is unknowable?
Are you interested in working life, or like a nuclear bomb goes off?
Yeah,
what do we do?
Well, let's start with the government advice that you should have, say, 3 days worth of provisions. I mean, I've heard it said that if you live in a city, you need to be able to kind of cope for maybe a week. The countryside, it's perhaps a month, and just the further away you go from civilization, the longer it is before help will come to you. But help will eventually come, is what we're told.
Well, I think that's probably been the case so far in kind of recent Western civilization. And as you say, the government's advice here is to have 3 days worth of food and water, which I'm pleased to say that I have. Perhaps people might like to be prepared for electronics or telecommunications not working. So in that vein, I actually have a kind of hand crank radio with a built-in torch.
Me too.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Well,
they're really good. You should get them from Amazon. Oh, don't say that. I mustn't.
We can get some walkie-talkies and we can be in touch in the event of a nuclear disaster.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, that's a thing that absolutely. I mean, what if surely one of the most likely scenarios is that there is an enormous cyber attack by some malicious player, and the internet goes out. We can't access our cash. We can't pay by card, and we can't get in touch with anybody. I mean, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, something like that would be could be a total disaster. And I write in the book about a natural form of that kind of thing, which is a solar storm. And so this is like another kind of burst of unwanted electromagnetic radiation from the sun, and it plays havoc with electronics. And I think most people in the energy industry feel that the transformers, which are the kind of big bits of equipment that kind of prepare currents to go onto the grid and take it back out, they think that we're probably safe, but we haven't been kind of measuring solar flares and that sort of thing for very long. So, we can't really be 100% confident what's around the corner. And if there were to be a huge solar storm and that were to kind of conk out all our electronics, then we wouldn't be going back to the Victorian age, because they had hand cranked water pumps and things like that, and horses. We'd be going back to the Stone Age. And I'm not making any claims as the likelihood of this. I simply don't know. But no, I think you're right. Those would be very trying circumstances.
As many people have said, once you have food and water, you've then got to have the guns to protect yourself. I mean, where does it stop? If you've got food and water and nobody else has,
Well, maybe you're thinking of the preppers who do buy gold bars and guns, the gold so they can bargain the guns, to defend themselves. And they might have months or years worth of food. It's nice to think that kind of with luck they'll have been slightly over-calibrated.
Do you think that there are countries, though, or organisations that are leading the way in disaster preparedness?
Oh, yeah, very much so. So, the US is a big, rich place with lots going on, and lots of the relevant kind of innovation is going on there. Some of it here as well. One organisation that springs to mind is the Alliance to Feed the Earth in the event of disaster, Allfed, which I did write about in the book, and they are trying to come up with ways in which we, humanity, could feed ourselves if something truly awful happens, because we can't really stockpile the amount of food we need to feed a planet. The warehouses would reach the moon because there'd be so much, and it would all rot. So they talk about things like eating mushrooms and harvesting seaweed and turning kind of fuel petrol and that kind of thing into stuff we can eat, all the stuff that we could do if it gets kind of very dark, and I mean literally dark, no sunlight, no crops.
Yeah. I mean, I hope people don't think that this book is all about that it's negative, because it's not. You also explore some really positive futures. I mean, I'm not going to allow you to talk about drilling into the earth.
Please, one more.
But what are some of those positive visions?
Visions for the future. Well, I also wrote about scientists who are trying to extend our lives, and often people kind of conflate this with eternal life, and they think, well, I don't want eternal life, which is by the by, because you're not going to get it. But perhaps we'll each get 20 to 30 additional years of being healthy and hanging out with our families, and I think that would be a very nice thing. So I'm pretty in favour of that, should it ever happen.
I mean, you say that you quote somebody saying the person that will live to 1,000 has already been born. Yeah,
I think that was Aubrey de Grey who said that, and I probably wouldn't bet on that. But the world's a kind of exciting and unpredictable place, and life is very different 100 years ago to what people might have thought it would be.
Do you think there's sort of one singular breakthrough that could completely change the trajectory for human life?
Yes. So people in the AI field refer to AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, and it's very, very kind of nebulous term. But effectively, what it means is a general purpose AI that, because it is general purpose and good quality, can emulate or even improve on the cognitive ability of a human in kind of any realm. And again, it depends who you ask, but there are some researchers who think that this is where things are going to get totally crazy, because if the AI has, scientific research ability, it can start augmenting itself very quickly. It could be like having, by this account, it could be like having, 1,000 kind of Stephen Hawkings or von Neumanns all working on the same project at once, 1,000 times faster than any human. And all bets are off if that happens. I mean, that could kind of, cure cancer in the first 30 seconds. God knows what else. Maybe it would be terrible. We simply don't know. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily round the corner. People at AI Labs, some of them say it is, the CEOs believe it is. But that would be the single innovation for sure that would change everything. It would touch any problem that we wanted.
Did writing this book make you feel more alarmed or more hopeful about the future?
Oh, I think because I'd been, as I say, working, I worked for a kind of philanthropic organisation before I wrote the book, and we were kind of interested in finding and funding the best opportunities to reduce the threats posed to humanity. And I think we as a kind of organisation certainly had some, let's call them dark tea times of the soul, when we were kind of reflecting on some of the more gloomy prognoses that we would receive. But I think there's also an extent to which interviewing hopeful and kind of high agency people working on these problems rubs off on you to some extent. But I suppose my fundamental view is that ultimately kind of we're kind of built on kind of pretty rudimentary biological clay, and we have what some psychologists refer to as a sort of happiness set point. And so we might suffer setbacks or enjoy great triumphs, and ultimately we'll revert to a pretty similar point on the happiness scale. And I'm not so kind of cognitively sophisticated that all this stuff that I've written about like goes so far down my brainstem that it really changes my mood in a very dramatic way day to day. So I think, despite writing about all of this kind of happy or like awful stuff, I've just been spat out at the end pretty much the same as I was.
Talking about ranking, various experts have what they call the P-Doom numbers.
The P-Doom. The P-Doom is basically the probability, that's P, you assign to doom. So maybe doom or everyone dying in the next 100 years. So, if your P-Doom is 0, let's make it slightly more cheerful. So your P-Rain, if your P-Rain is 0, it's not raining. Like you're outside, you just know for sure it's not raining. If your P-Rain is 1, you are soaking wet already.
So where do we stand?
Well, I'm just a kind of humble scribe. I think that these questions are so complex that I think to assign, at least for me to assign like a proper number to my own P-Doom is a waste of everyone's time. Yours, the listeners, mine. I think I could certainly be sort of poked into saying that whatever my P-Doom is, it's higher than I would like. I feel a little. I mean, it's very tricky because there's so many kind of technical and social questions. I think I would be surprised if humans in some form didn't make it to the next century, albeit not totally shocked.
So there is some life to come.
I hope so.
Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.